how should we design learning experiences that are engaging and relevant?
So when I looked at this question, it made me think about there's two areas of focus, like what might be engaging and relevant, and then also the other side of like actually designing for that. So I think my answer would be kind of two parts. As I was processing this, I was thinking, you know, from the design side of it, like how should we design? And it made me think about, as a teacher myself, oftentimes I found myself designing experiences in isolation, planning to meet my students' needs, but even though I was part of like a science department, it wasn't that I was necessarily working with colleagues and collaborating to design something that we wanted all of our students to have. And so I think, like, with that being said, you know, designing in collaboration with others who will be working with our students together, I think would be great. So
what does adding more voices to that conversation, or like adding members to the design team, actually do?
Sure.
Like, instead of that single teacher, you know, sort of designing for her students that she knows pretty well, you know, she has an understanding of what they need. What does adding folks to that equation actually do?
Yeah, I think like it would add different perspectives where I might read, if I'm, let's say, the science teacher, I may be looking at the student through a science type lens, while at the same time like acknowledging maybe what their interests and passions are, kind of understanding if they have a plan. And I think that if I was able to design with other teachers who this student is engaged with, like for example with the English language arts teacher, with the social studies teacher, with the math teacher, they might all be bringing a different lens on that student that creates a more holistic, like high definition portrait of them as a learner. And it might also, at the same time, like not just me meeting the needs of that student through a science context, allow for us to be able to design a learning experience that goes across content and that is able to, you know, maybe centered on a project or something where a student's able to develop and show competencies, not just in isolation in like a science classroom or a math or so on and so forth, but actually like have that mixed up so that they're learning within the context of something that they're interested in real life that is actually happening in these different content areas. So like I'm taking it from a secondary perspective,
from secondary,
like departmental kind of way of thinking of it.
How do you feel like the students should be involved in that process?
Well, I definitely think like, so I would go back to the design process, like human-centered design. And thinking about that is the first step in just the design process is that empathy piece. So myself as a designer, as a teacher who's attempting to design a learning experience for my user, aka the student, alongside colleagues hopefully, that we're listening to that student's needs. We're asking questions. You know, I'll get data on the student, and it might be specific to cognitive abilities and academic achievement potentially. But what about the other pieces of like intra and interpersonal skills that they might have? What about their interests and their passions? Like I'd like to find out from that student, from my students, like what are they interested in? You introduced the idea of a learner profile. Like what are their learning needs? What do they like and what are hurdles, so that it helps me have a higher definition portrait of that student to help me then in creating experiences that will meet their needs because I've got that information. So really, I guess what I'm saying is that asking questions and digging deeper with students to be able to create a more meaningful relationship so I can design for learning experiences that meet their needs.
So you said that there were two parts to this, right? That one was the design element. What's the second part?
Okay, so the second part was that are engaging and relevant. So one thing to design something, but then this like it is this. So that's where I was thinking about the connected learning framework is something that I like to always go back to because it's a set of design principles and and principles around like how people best learn, and then while at the same time like being able to use tools to empower, bringing out the best in our kids and making connections. It's not necessarily like tool centric. Being an ed tech guy, like I definitely love tools, but at the same time though, it's bigger than that, and it's all meant to create, an experience that's equitable, social, and participatory for like all students. So when I think about engaging and relevant, I start thinking of these tenets in connected learning. Like, for example, how is the experience interest driven for our students? Like, if I'm listening to the students in that design process, like, am I able to provide opportunities for the student to be able to personalize, to follow their interests and their passions, to be able to engage in learning? That will help it become more relevant to them. While at the same time, there is an opportunity gap for many of our students, especially in Aurora, around being able to see the relevance of their learning experience in school and how that might apply to life after school or outside of school. So I would definitely want to see, like, how are we creating openly networked experiences so that there can be learning that happens like across generations and inside of school and outside of school, and kids get exposure not just to like maybe the academic core inside of school, but also developing 21st century skills, and then being able to make connections with partners we might have in the community to be able to see like, oh, here, having these skills can help me maybe solve these problems, or to create this thing, or to get this kind of a job. So I think that's really important. So using that framework of connected learning to help like create these engaging, relevant experiences.
So that idea of openly networked, right? Like, you are making the connection sort of for and with kids to things that are outside of their lived experience, perhaps, right? And I think that's one of the struggles that folks have with sort of, well, if it's interest-based, nobody's going to be interested in math, right? And while I get really geeked out about a lot of the things that I use math for, which are statistics and which are, like solving problems, I think that question is very open. And so, are there other ways in which we can support teachers and leaders in saying, yes, it can be interest-based, but it's about relevance, or it is the we are making math relevant. We are making the tough subjects, the rigorous work that we're doing relevant. Are there things that teachers can be doing? Is there, other than like a framework of connected learning,
Sure.
what are the really specific tasks or moves that a teacher can make that makes those things that I think kids struggle with finding relevancy and sort of that level of engagement with?
Sure. So it makes me think about like the academically oriented piece inside of the connected learning framework, which is really like creating experiences for our students to connect those interests. Like, yeah, sure, we have interest driven, and like you said, maybe a lot of people might gravitate away from math and they might not like that. But to connect interests and also like their social engagement to these academic studies, and I think that's really important, is like, what kinds of experiences are they having socially that are reinforcing maybe some of these more like hard skill academic things that we need them to learn. I think also with civic engagement and also career opportunity, being able to take like what's being learned in a classroom, if it is math, how might it apply to in this relevant piece, maybe advocacy for something for people in need, and it's incorporated in that math into it. So I'm imagining, like, for teachers, how might we support being able to leverage like the social engagement that students might have, peer-to-peer supported, also connections to this civic engagement, this civic responsibility, real problems that are actually out there in our communities that they might want to solve, and then also link that up to what sorts of careers that exist now that might be opportunities to be able to engage in that as well. So when they leave school, they might want to jump into something like that. So it's kind of adding like more dimensions to the academic experience of just, we're going to learn this hard skill, but let's also connect that out to the world around us, I think is pretty important.
It's almost the difference between sort of being a student versus being a citizen, and the way in which we are sort of responsible for supporting citizenship, essentially, within our community, and sort of solving problems that are going on within the community. You see that as a way of making, what are fairly rigorous. I mean, like, the problems that are in our community are incredibly rigorous to solve, right?
Sure.
So if we can solve some of those problems, that we will have to use those real world skills and the sort of hard skills that we're learning, the academic skills. And so you see that as kind of the connection that we can make for and with kids.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes me think also that, like, humans are social creatures. Like, we have gotten to where we are evolutionarily speaking on this planet because we build communities and because we're able to communicate effectively with one another and do those sorts of things. And so it makes me think about, like, how do we support teachers in creating learning experiences where we can capitalize on that, especially for adolescents, because the brain is wiring itself to leave the nest, and so it's creating. We think the teenagers are, they're thinking crazy, but their brain is wiring itself to make these social connections so they have a support structure around them when they leave the nest, so they can find success once they move into beyond home and school and into life. And so I wonder, how do we capitalize on that? And also, like, because we're social creatures, we like to get behind something and be part of a team. We like to be part of a winning team. And so if we can work together with a shared purpose, both inside of our school, amongst our peers, but also with others outside of school, and find this shared purpose, maybe advocating to solve certain problems within our immediate social sphere, there might be more buy-in. It might create more relevance and be more engaging for students.
Yeah, I mean, I think that concept of community, the way in which we are members of the community and serve our community, I think is going to be really important as we try and answer this question. All right, well, I want to make sure that we have time to have a question from you, and so I'd love to hear a question that you have been asking a lot, or one that has been sort of eating at you a little bit, that you find yourself just asking or trying to answer.
Sure. So mine is definitely rooted in equity. And, I was looking at the slide where it was, what are the barriers what are some 3 barriers, or some barriers to equity? And I was thinking about that. I almost did that one. But that is a question that I grapple with, is that we in Aurora Public Schools, I would have to say that in the division of equity and learning, I believe we're pretty solid on the why of equity. Like, why would we want to create equitable access to technology and learning environments and opportunities to help our kids move forward? I think we're all good on that. And the what, to a certain extent, in the idea of, like, using a framework of, let's say, the culturally responsive education, 6 themes inside of that, and, like, being able to learn what those are and how that kind of fits together to create engaging experiences that are rigorous. So my question really is around the how. Like, how does this play out in a classroom? What are the moves that a teacher is making, both maybe collaboratively designing learning experiences with their colleagues? What moves are they making, both in forming relationships or leveraging technology or what, fill in the blank, that leads to equity outcomes for all students? So, like, just trying to understand, like, how do we do this? How do we take, like, this sort of theoretical framework and see that play out in the classroom and be able to study that, so that we can begin to capture models that are finding success that are successful with our students, so that we can, first replicate, but then redefine, because there's different needs of different people in different environments, but to eventually habitualize that. So how do we do this? What does it look like? What are these models? And study that. That's a big question for me.
Absolutely. So not the why, not the what, but the how of equity.
Mm-hmm.
that's really valuable to keep on asking, and it kind of brings up this idea of how do we also then share the practice. Like if you're cultivating the practice of or equitable practices in your classroom, and you are finding something that is very effective, how are you then sharing that with others, right? Like that's not something we want to hide or keep in a single classroom or a single school. Do you have ideas about how we disseminate and sort of allow those practices to take hold more district-wide rather than like in pockets and sort of those kinds of things?
Sure. Like I've thought about this and with like the ed tech team and others, and I think like first and foremost it starts with reflection. So anybody in the system who's like making these moves, and I'm thinking about like tequity right now, and our definition of tequity are a set of practices both at in the classroom level, the school level, and district level, that when there's instructional tools available, we're marrying that with our equity work. And so if we're going to shake that out, then we've got to ask people to be reflective and to think about like the moves they're making. And so through that reflection, I believe there could be many different means of being able to reflect. I know, like you've had a series of videos before I believe you said your wife cut you off because you were driving and capturing reflections like after work and stuff. But being that verbal processor that you are. But I think that that's important though, is that with time to reflect. And so there might be different mediums in which teachers would be reflecting on these moves they've made and being able to cite like evidence of success. And so that might be in the form of video, it might be audio, it might be blog posts, it might be, whatever, personal journal or something like that. But I think it's also helping then to foster a culture of sharing that allows for people to, unlike like my sister who might hide her diary in some place where I'll never find it if I was ever to look for it, and I never did that.
No, clear.
But like how might we help ourselves as professionals become open and transparent and be vulnerable in sharing out these reflections and our approximation, because no one I believe is going to just like step onto the field and like necessarily hit a home run like over and over and over again. I mean, we're approximating this, we're learning this is shared inquiry, but that process of that, capturing that in different mediums that work for us, then I think having some sort of like connected learning ecosystem set up where we're able to, in the digital space, like be able to take like all the stuff that I've kind of been collecting and reflecting and sort of package up some of that and put that out there and have others like take a look at that and maybe give me feedback on it, and I do that for peers. But to be able to have like a common place where we can have elevated discourse around this in a safe environment where we're not shaking out non-examples, but understanding that, hey, we're all approximating this, we're all in it together, let's learn together and talk about these things. So I definitely think like leveraging like some sort of digital space where we can meet up synchronously and asynchronously, but it takes a culture shift for many to be able to be vulnerable, to put out practice and say, this really worked for me, and these are the moves I made, and this is how it fits in with the 6 themes of a theme in culture relevant education. To go public like that, it takes some time and a culture shift. So.
Right. Well, in that shared space, right, that can look like a lot of different things, but the idea is that it is shared, right?
Absolutely. And accessible.
Accessible, right. Yeah. And so when you are coming together in whatever capacity you have the ability to do, then that is the place where you're sharing, and it is that safe space, and sort of you can be vulnerable in that place. I think that's a really good question to ask, and hopefully one that we will answer together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I really appreciate your time.